In this video, I'm going to tell you why your front desk staff continues to quit, and I want to show you exactly how to stop it. So, we're going to cover a few things in this video. Number one, I'm going to tell you how do you structure your hiring process. It's going to be much different and actually set you up for success. Number two, I'm going to tell you what admins kind of secretly say when I do exit interviews with them after they quit and tell you why they quit. And then I'm going to tell you about the silent killers of your retention process when it comes to retaining and onboarding your staff. And so this is the exact hiring and onboarding strategies I use when I'm working with practice owners and what I've used in my own cash practice so that their admin's actually going to stick around and actually perform for years to come. And on average, employees stick around for 3+ years when they have a solid onboarding process. And so by the end of this, I want to share how to hire front desk staff so that you can set expectations and they're going to want to stick around for many years to come, as opposed to being a revolving door, which is kind of what most of you guys are dealing with right now. So, now I want to share some statistics here. These were pretty shocking to me as I was just kind of like looking and I was just really curious, right? Because one of the big things I help practice owners with is how do I like hire and find front desk talent? How do I actually onboard them and actually get them to stick around and perform? The front desk is such a high turnover position. So I was just merely looking up some statistics for staff members and kind of getting an idea of what that looked like. And these are really interesting. And then I want to share a story and then we'll get right into the meat and the potatoes of this stuff. So, one thing I found was that retention is boosted by 82% if a company had a strong onboarding process. That's pretty solid, right? 82% that's a pretty massive number. And obviously something we want to like that's way more than a 50-50 chance of just kind of flipping a coin, which is what most of you guys when you're hiring people look like. Now, the problem with that is only 12% of employees reported that they had a satisfactory onboarding process when working with a company. So there's a pretty big mismatch. Companies know they need kind of a retention and onboarding plan. They think they have it, but staff is only saying that 12% of companies are doing it when they went through it. It's pretty low, right? Now, only 43% of employees reported that their onboarding lasted more than 1 day. That's a pretty big problem as well, because most of you guys are like, hey, here's a handbook. Like, let me know if you have questions. And that's not an onboarding process. And that's ultimately what can set you guys up for problems with retention. And so I want to share a story about an admin that what we do is we basically either train your existing front desk staff or help you find an in-person admin, or I've got a team of remote US based admins that we can basically plug into your practice. And so I had an admin who had been working with me and we trained her up, we got her, sent the candidates over and this particular practice chose this admin. Now, they were like, hey, on paper, she looks great. I think she's going to be a good fit for us. We plugged her in, and there was a lot of challenges over the first couple of weeks, right? Where, things were kind of slipping through the cracks a little bit. I was having conversations with the admin, and some of her feedback was, I just feel like I'm getting a lot of stuff thrown at me, and nothing's kind of going well. And so ultimately, this person continued to miss some things, and we just couldn't get it figured out. And so, one of my promises to the practice owners that, hey, we'll pull anybody out you're not happy with and give you a whole new set of candidates. And so that's exactly what we did. And so I was kind of racking my brain. I was really confused because the person I was talking to was really bright, right? Like she'd gone through our extensive vetting process, which is usually a 4-step interview process. She'd gone through a lot of training. She matched with the first practice that she had interviewed with, and so it's like there's just something missing here. It's like had a master's degree as well, and so I was just confused. And so what I did is she on paper and some of her intangibles, her phone calls were great, and so I literally wanted to take a gamble, and I said, hey, I want to place you with another practice, and I want to see what happens. Funny enough, I let her in interview process with the next uh, group of interviews that came through the next practice, and she got hired again on right there on the spot. And this particular clinic was a little bit different, but it was the same, discipline, the same kind of processes. There was nothing wildly different with it. And this particular admin after 2 weeks, things were going really well. I checked in with the practice owner, checked in with the admin. Everybody felt pretty good. And I got a unprompted text message about a month into her working with him that said, "Hey, this is the best admin that we've had in this position in years, maybe even ever. And I was pretty shocked, right? And what then went on was this journey to try to figure out what did this practice do differently with this same exact person that was now a rock star for them, but was a problem for another practice. And ultimately, I interviewed the heck out of this admin as well to try to understand those things, the practice owners between these two practices as well. And I wanted to figure out what was different. And that's exactly where most of these points that I'm going to share with you today, that can be a really big piece of it. Now, I do want to back up a little bit because some of you guys may not use one of our like remote admins, and most of this stuff still comes down to the hiring process. That's the first big step of this: is how do I actually vet and get candidates in? Because what most of you guys do at the front desk is the front desk quits, you freak out, you very quickly throw an Indeed ad up, and you get two people with a pulse that actually submits their resume and they actually show up for the interview. And you're like, well, I guess I'll hire one of these two people. And you make a really hasty hire. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that you can make, because you don't really know that candidate. After you look at their interview, maybe you do a quick phone interview with them and you do an in-person interview. You just don't know enough about that person after those two interactions. Like I think I've mentioned on some of my other trainings, it's like we get 400 or 500 people that apply to work with us on a given month. Obviously, I can't interview 400 to 500 people, but the people that I do get down to a smaller group of folks, I'm interviewing 2 and 3 times on the back end of that so that I can make sure that this person is the right fit for what we're looking for. Right. And so we want to hire very slow. That's the biggest takeaway from the hiring process. Hire slow, have a multi step interview process, and you want to weed out low motivation folks. And I've done some other trainings on this. My ultimate hiring guide video, I can link that below as well, where I walk through this process a little bit more extensively. But you need to have ways to weed out low motivation folks, and you need to have a multi-step interview process. One of those is you need to test the skills needed for the job: multitasking, jumping on a phone call, using a computer, all of that good stuff. And then also a working interview where you actually spend some time working side by side this person, because now that's going to help them have an idea of what the day-to-day operations of the job looks like, and that's going to help you see how they actually respond in real time. What I don't want to have happen is I hire this person in a week in, it's like, things aren't going well. Maybe it'll get better. And then 2 months pass, and then 4 months pass, and then 6 months pass, and then this person just quits, right? Or you just continue to deal with underperformance, which is obviously something we don't want to have happen either. So have a robust hiring process that's slow and actually gets people where you want to go. So that's going to be a big one. Make sure the hiring process is ironed out. Now, the next big one is we need to have expectations managed on the front end, and we need to ultimately make sure we're leading this front desk person very, very well. So after I get through with the hiring and vetting process, I need to make sure that the expectations are set from day one. I ultimately chat with some admins, and this is where, I've had conversations with them as they quit. And this particular admin that I chatted with, the biggest thing that it came down to was what were the expectations and how well, or lack thereof, was this particular person managed. And those were the two biggest things that continually come up as I interview admins who leave. And they were shocked at the amount of work that they were doing, or they were shocked at the some of the tasks that they were doing, or they were just like, "Wow, this office is a chaotic mess," and I just wasn't expecting that to be the case. And so, those are some things we want to think about. We'll talk about expectations here first. Uh, We need to set expectations about pay, what the day-to-day tasks look like, what ultimately I need this role to be. And because so many people have no idea what that's supposed to look like. I've had admins step in, they were just like, wow, I was not expecting to be doing all of these tasks. And you can list it on a piece of paper, or you can talk about it in one sentence in the interview, but until it's abundantly clear to the person who's going to be working in that position day in and day out, there's no way that that person is going to want to stick around. Because if you say, hey, this is going to be a front desk role, and I'm expecting you to do 100 different tasks, which is where a lot of your practices are, right? You've got them doing greetings to new customers that are walking in. You've got them doing all of their back end paperwork. You've got them doing new patient phone calls. You've got them doing social media. And it's like, whoa, like that's a lot of task. And now this admin is going to be sprung all over the place. And so maybe you need to restructure your front desk. But ultimately, that front desk person needs to know what that day to day looks like. Because if they don't truly and fully understand what the day to day looks like, and they go to step into your front desk, and that expectation is different than what they had in their mind, there is no way they're going to stick around. And you wouldn't either, right? Like, if you're a provider and you thought that, your day to day was going to look like one thing, where they said, hey, yeah, you're going to see, 20 patients, or you're going to see 10 to 15 patients a day, and you walk in and now you're seeing 25 or 30 patients per day, you bet you're going to quit pretty quick, right? Because your expectations were mismanaged, and what you thought you were getting yourself into is actually very different. And the way that you can make sure expectations are clear are doing a working interview, right? Where they actually step in and see how things work. You actually listen and get some feedback from them during the onboarding process as well about, hey, things you need to change or tweak. But ultimately, you also need to set expectations of what success looks like, and set expectations of what the day to day is going to look like in nitty gritty detail so that no one's actually shocked. Now, the other big piece of this, or things I hear from admins as they're going to kind of exit, and kind of some of the secrets that they share, the other big one was how they were led. And that is either the lack thereof or the micromanagement of them as well. Some of you guys are, there's typically two ends of the spectrum. Sometimes we got some people in the middle, but the two ends of the spectrum are, hey, I'm real passive and I kind of just roll with it. And I kind of just want my admin to kind of figure it out, because you're kind of a chill person and you started this like lifestyle kind of cash practice. And now you've got somebody that needs to step in and help. And ultimately, they're just kind of roaming around. They're not real sure what they're supposed to be doing. They're not real sure what defines success. And it's just kind of a little like they're just a little unsure. Or on the flip side, I get somebody who just micromanages the heck out of them, right? Where they're on them about every little single detail. They're constantly messaging them day in and day out. They're constantly throwing tasks at them left and right, and it's this constant barrage of things. And when we are constantly hammering them with things, or they're constantly new tasks popping up, like that's pretty stressful and not a great place that we ultimately want to work, and that we're ultimately going to want to stick around. And so it's less about who you hired, and it's more about what expectations did we set, and how did we lead and manage this person throughout our duration of them working with us. Those are two big things you want to make sure that you're looking at. Now, the final piece of this is, hey, what are some of the killers of you retaining staff? And most of that comes back to a very clear onboarding process. And what most practices do not have is an onboarding process in any capacity. Oftentimes, you are intuitively better at doing it with a new clinician. Like, you brought another PT, another chiro, another doc on board, and you kind of know the flow of like, hey, here's how we do things in the office. Here's how we treat patients, and inevitably they're a little bit bright, because they are medical providers at the end of the day, and so the onboarding process feels a little bit more intuitive. Now, with front desk staff, that onboarding process is not usually quite as clear. And so when we don't have a clear onboarding process and we're not getting regular feedback throughout the mix, then ultimately it leads to drop off, right? Some of the statistics we shared at the beginning of this video. And one of the biggest things that can really separate, like I know for me, as I've had my cash practice for, gosh, 6 years at this point, one of the biggest things that I've always noticed was, as I tried to step my way out of as much patient care, and as we started to grow and have more and more staff, the more time I spent with my staff, where I just listened and we just had conversations, was the most impactful to me, to understand the problems that my practice had, right? The challenges. And if I don't know what problems or challenges are there, or I don't have an open enough door policy to for my staff to feel comfortable sharing that, then ultimately they were going to quit, or ultimately we were just going to continue to underperform. And the more time, especially, you could spend with front desk staff, the more likely they are going to want to stick around and do a very good job for you, right? Where now their productivity increases. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to set a weekly one-on-one meeting, especially in the onboarding process. It's a non-negotiable. You need to be meeting weekly, especially in a cash practice, so that we can make sure our phone calls sound like they need to sound, and we're ultimately leading this person and getting them to where they want to go. Because if we're not meeting and I'm not hearing the challenges, because what worked for you or what worked for the previous front desk, or maybe this person's got some better ideas about how to structure things and set stuff up. And if you're not open enough to take feedback, that's one of the biggest things that's going to be critical. That's a deal breaker for me as I hire somebody. That's going to be a thing that's going to be really hard for you as an owner to retain staff if you're not meeting and able to take feedback from them. So, what else in the onboarding process helps set folks up for long-term success and retaining staff? The other big one is I need to have tracking and metrics for success. One of the easiest ways I do this is I have a weekly and a monthly scorecard that all my staff submit to me weekly and monthly, and it's got the metrics in it that define success for their position, and it also takes into account. I just want to know how they're feeling, what things look like. Because if I don't have clear metrics of what success looks like, there's nothing worse than getting 6 months in and being like, "Hey, you're not doing a good job." It's like, well, what do you mean I haven't been doing a good job? I've been working, and you're just now telling me this. And so this allows them to know what that success is, and it ultimately helps us to stay on track throughout the year, right? I want to be catching these things a week out, a month out, not 6 months out. And when somebody knows they're doing a good job because the metrics tell them, and you're telling them they're doing a good job, they're going to be much more bought in. And if they're not within KPI or they're not hitting their metrics, then hey, what do we need to do during our weekly meetings so that I can coach and lead you to get where you want to go? Is it a skill issue or is it a process issue? Like, what's the problem here? Now, the other big one during this onboarding process is this is where we set expectations. Hey, here's what I want these weekly meetings to look like. Here's how I want feedback from you, and here's how I'm going to give you feedback as well. And if I can't give you feedback, then that's ultimately going to be a big, big challenge, right? And just setting the expectation for what defines success. And that's where those metrics, the scorecards can really be super helpful. And I like to sit down and I like to just map out what the next 90 days looks like. Obviously, it's a rough template. That thing's going to change and modify over time, but that front desk person needs to see the roadmap for where you're headed and how you're going to ultimately get them to where they want to go and help them reach the goal that they have in working in as your front desk staff as well. And so if I can have a clear onboarding process for 90 days, ultimately you're going to see a massive boost in retention, a massive boost in profitability and productivity because they know exactly how to get there. And that's why that onboarding process is so crystal clear. And if majority of employees are saying that the place that they work doesn't have an onboarding process, I can almost bet then you don't either, right? And most of you don't. You just kind of throw some stuff up and hope for the best. And that's ultimately what I don't want to have happen in your practice. So those are kind of the things in a nutshell of how I ultimately reduce turnover at the front desk. We want to make sure that we're, having systems and processes in place where we can hire slow, we can vet candidates out, and then ultimately have a really solid onboarding process to get them where they want to go. So now that you know how to actually find and vet that talent, now we actually have to teach them and get them up to speed on all things sales, especially if you are a cash practice. I created a entirely free resource for this. It's called our Front Desk School. All you have to do is click the button below, and that'll link you over. There's like over 2.5 hours of free trainings in there, and or you can also check out some of our additional videos, including our sales script, here on our YouTube channel. Awesome. We'll talk soon.